We'd like to get started now. Thanks for dealing with all our technical difficulties here for a moment. Today we're going to talk a lot about water and permitting and just different things that are, we talked about getting into biodiesel the first day. The second day, yesterday, we talked a lot about making biodiesel, the testing and such. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the regulatory things that go with it. And so we have two people here from Colorado that are going to talk about water and also other things. We're going to hear a little bit later today about business planning, things that are somewhat extemporaneous to biodiesel, but incredibly important if you truly want to do this on a larger scale. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dick Wolfe. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Probably they see easier from off. It's up to them if they want to take those. Does that work good? You might want to fall asleep. Okay. I think that'll work good. Thank you. Well, I'm impressed to see all of you here on Sunday morning. That's amazing. I think this is probably my first professional presentation on a Sunday morning, so I guess it is an opportunity to be here. And what I'm going to be talking about, and Gary will follow up with me, we're with the state of Colorado. I'm with the Department of Natural Resources, and within that, the Division of Water Resources. And Gary will be talking about it from the Department of Public Health and Environment, kind of the discharge side of it. And I'm going to talk about water supply side and how we handle it in Colorado. Again, what you're talking about in terms of your industry and biodiesel or biofuels is kind of new in terms of anything our agency is dealing with. So I guess bear with me a little bit in some of the stuff I've tried to put together for you and how I think it might relate to if you're doing business in Colorado and using water within Colorado, what might apply. And certainly in the time I have here for you today, I'm not going to make you experts in water in Colorado, but hopefully make you aware of what's out there and what you would have to deal with. And there's a lot of links on our website that you can go to get additional information, and I'll point those out. My presentation, I did bring copies of it, but I will put it on our website. And at the end of the slide here is our web address, and you can Google it as well. But I'll put them out there. We put all our presentations we do on the website. So if you do have an interest in any of the slides I have today, you're certainly welcome to get to our website and get those. So let's see. Hey, it does work. Okay, I know it's Sunday morning. It's a little bit of a test, but somebody tell me what these three locations have in common?
Not much water.
Very good. Exactly right. You probably recognize some of these, the arches and some of that, but this bottom picture down here is Civic Center Park in downtown Denver. But in terms of the climate that exists in these three locations, they're all three considered semi-arid deserts. They get between 10 to 20 inches of precipitation a year. Certainly Colorado is unique. We get certainly more precipitation in the mountain areas than we do on the plains, but on average, it's between 10 and 20 inches per year. And so we have a lot of different environment and a lot of different availability of water resources to deal with than you do when you're east of the Mississippi River, where you may have 2 to 3 times the amount of average precipitation that we do here in Colorado. So it certainly is unique in that regard, but it also poses a lot of challenges to anybody who wants to utilize water in our state. And I hope you'll gain an appreciation of that as I go through my presentation. As I indicated, I'm in with the Division of Water Resources, and we're a division within the department. We're one of 9 agencies within the Department of Natural Resources. A lot of the western states operate in this kind of fashion, these kind of natural resource agencies within a main department. And maybe if you've done any work here in Colorado or you are from Colorado, you've probably heard of some of these. Of course, Oil and Gas Conservation Commission is a very active division within our department right now with all the oil and gas activity that's going on in the state. Certainly your business is an energy-related one. We're dealing with a lot of water issues with the oil and gas operations in Colorado as well. So the others, we do provide support to a lot of the other agencies. State parks, they got a lot of water resources with state parks, Wild Fish and Wildlife, otherwise, and lesser so with the others. Just to give you an idea of what the Division of Water Resources does, some of our major responsibilities. Water administration is our primary responsibility. We administer all the surface and groundwater in the state. We've been doing this for over 125 years. Last year was our 125th anniversary of the Division of Water Resources, which back then was called the State Engineer's Office. It wasn't until 1969 before we became part of the department and was formerly known as the Division of Water Resources. So this is our primary function. We are the sole agency that does water administration in the state. Public safety, in that we have two programs. One is water well construction. We have well inspectors who go out just like somebody goes out and inspects your home when it's constructed for plumbing, electrical, and so forth. We do this for our water wells in the state. We also do it for dams in the state. We are in charge of administering over 3,000 dams in the state, 1,800 of those what we call jurisdictional, to make sure that they're safe and operational and public safety and health environment of those dams are not jeopardized. And we've been very successful in keeping very safe dams in the state. We've had very few failures and very minimal loss of property or life in the state. So it's a very excellent program. Groundwater permitting. We are the sole agency in the state that issues permits for water wells, not oil and gas wells, but if you're doing any kind of well that has anything to do with extracting groundwater out of it, you're going to get a permit through the Division of Water Resources. We issue about 7,000 to 8,000 well permits a year, and about 70% of those are for residential type well permits. Interstate compacts, this is very important. We're one of two headwater states in the United States, meaning all the water flows out and then flows in. Can somebody tell me what is the other headwater state in the United States? It's the only thing we have in common with this state, by the way.
Alaska.
Hawaii. So, all water flows out of the state, flows in. So, and this is important because we have 9 interstate compacts. Being a headwater state, all our major river drainages that flow out of the state. Of course, before we became part of the United States, all these people utilized water on these streams, before the geographic boundaries came in for the state of Colorado. And so we had to continue to honor those uses that were there. And so we entered into compacts with our downstream sister states to make sure that we deliver what they're entitled to. And so this is a very important operation of ours. And the reason I'm pointing out a lot of these things too is because it plays into the whole big picture when you're dealing with water in the state. Why we're dealing with such a small amount of water and why it's so important, because we have all these other obligations with our water. Hydrographic program. We're the only state in the western United States that has our own hydrographic program where we maintain all of the stream gauging stations. We have over 440 stream gauging stations in the state. Normally the U.S. Geological Survey does this. We do cooperate with them on a number of other gauging stations in Colorado. So we have 440 of our own. We can do it about half the cost of USGS. And all of this information is put on the satellite. You can go on our website. A lot of people use this, whether you're rafting, fishing, want to know high flows, low flows. This program is what keeps that going. And we have hydrographers who go out and gauge those streams and make sure they're measuring flow accurately. It helps tremendously in our water administration. And you'll see as I talk today, why that's so important. Public information services, of course, all this information we gather on stream flow records and diversion records, everything like water in Colorado, we make available to the public either on our web or through our offices throughout the state. When we administer water in Colorado, this is similar to a lot of other states. We have over 173,000 water rights that we administer. We have about 270 employees statewide. About 120 of those are what we call water commissioners who are out in the field, men and women, who do this on a daily basis, who go to these these head gates that are here and make sure that people are getting the amount of water they're entitled to, and if they're not entitled to it, they make sure that those gates are closed. And I'll talk about how we do that in just a minute. So you can see of those 173,000 water rights, how many observations and measurements we make of those every year. We only maintain about a little over 30,000 water diversion and storage records, and that's because even though there's 173,000 water rights, some of these are inactive because they don't divert very often, because we're in a state that's very over-appropriated. There's more demand for water than there's available, and so only in very wet years do some of these other rights come in and are able to get water. And you'll see the last one on there, we have over 250,000 wells in the state that we administer as well. These are water wells, not oil and gas wells. When you throw the oil and gas wells in there, which we don't administer, there's over 30,000 oil and gas wells in the state. You can see with a lot of holes in the ground, there's always potential for contamination, and that's why we have our well inspection program to make sure these wells are constructed properly. Well, this is what drives everything, and this is throughout the world. It's not unique to Colorado, although this is pretty typical of Colorado. The mountains is a hydrologic cycle. That's what we get from Mother Nature is what we're able to distribute and use within our boundaries. And of course, as we get snowfall in the wintertime and it runs off, it recharges our rivers and lakes and the underground aquifers that are out there. And of course, since we became part of the Union in 1876, it's embodied in the Constitution, our administration system, and I'll talk about that here in just a second, slide or two. And so that's very important that this system is in place. It's commonly referred to as the Colorado Doctrine, but it's also referred to as the Appropriation Doctrine, and I'll talk about that here in just a minute. Well, what happens when the Colorado, because of the uniqueness of the mountains and the orographic effects, when we have the snow melt runoff, this is on the Colorado River, which is on the western slope near Docero. This snow melt in an average year melts off in kind of this bell-shaped curve. And so when we have 80% of our precipitation in Colorado is in the form of snowfall. And so when it runs off in about 3 months out of the year. So it's only available over a very short period of time out of the entire year. And you can see what happens. See, I've got two other graphs on here, 1977 and 2002. 2002, if any of you have been in Colorado or any of the western states in 2002, it was certainly a record of all droughts, certainly 300 to 500 years according to a lot of records. Certainly in recorded history, it was the driest year that we've ever had on record. And so you can see what happens when you have very little snowpack, when you typically would have a peak year here, and then you end up with a very low year like in 2002. It makes it very difficult to, when you got all this demands for water on the system, to make sure everybody gets what they think they want or what they're entitled to. And this is why storage becomes so important in Colorado. This is what we commonly refer to as our snake diagram. It's a pretty popular graph that people like to get from our office, and it tells has a lot of information. It's really literally a picture that says 1,000 words. But you can see the geographic boundary here of the Continental Divide, which runs through the middle of the state. And as I indicated, we get 80% of our precipitation in the form of snowfall and 20% rainfall. And this 80-20 rule works pretty good in a lot of respects in Colorado. And if you look on the western slope here, you can see by the size of these streams here, these are gauging station numbers here over long periods of record, what the average flow is at those points. So you can see obviously the western slope of the Colorado River is our largest river in Colorado. And of course, it feeds a number of other states downstream all the way to the Republic of Mexico. It certainly has been fraught with a lot of controversy over the years and continues to be. But this indicates the size of this bands here kind of indicates the level of flow in the rivers. And so we have essentially 80% of the available water supply in Colorado exists on the western slope, and 80% of our population exists on the east slope, of course in the Denver metro areas. You can see in the northeast quadrant of the state what is referred to as Division 1 there, the South Platte Drainage. It has our largest irrigated area in the state, has the largest population base in the state, but you can obviously see from the diagram there, it certainly doesn't have the most water in the state. And so I'm going to talk about how we get around that a little bit. But this gives you just an idea of kind of the magnitude of flows in here. And I think the other thing that's important to point out in this, if you see at the very bottom here, you may not be able to read it, but it says total amount of flow, average flow leaving the state. There's a little over 10.2 million acre feet a year on average. In total precipitation in the state, we generate about 16 million acre feet a year. And an acre foot is about 326,000 gallons. And so when you think about it on an average basis, when we generate 16 million acre feet from precipitation in Colorado on an average year, and we deliver through these interstate compacts I talked about 10 million acre feet to our downstream sister states, Colorado only gets to utilize about 6 million acre feet a year, about a third of that available water supply. And so when you look at a year like 2002 and the drought we had, we generated only 4 million acre feet, a quarter of what we do on average. So you can see what a huge range in available water supplies we have in the state of Colorado, and why it's so important that we have storage. And also the other unique thing that's being on the Continental Divide that we're able to take advantage of is what we call trans-mountain diversions. These started back in about 1890. You'll see over here on some of these in the Grand River Ditch is one of the first ones that was constructed up here in about 1890 to bring water over from these water-rich areas of the state over into the eastern Plains where all the population base was taken off. And so this northeastern part here, there's 17 trans-mountain versions which bring over about 400,000 acre-feet of water a year into that basin. And that certainly is what helped provide a supplemental supply of those basins, certainly all to the eastern. But you can see throughout the state, there's trans-mountain versions going everywhere. These water-rich areas around Silverton, where we get tremendous amounts of snowfall. They take that water, runs off into those basins, and takes it to some of these other areas throughout the state. So this gives you an idea of what we're dealing with our available water supply and how we have to administer it in the state. This is kind of how we fool Mother Nature, I guess, to some degree, when we take water from where it's not where we need it. And that happens throughout the world, as you can imagine. People want to move to areas where it's typically not always water rich, and we're piping water from great distances in a lot of areas of the United States as well as the world. Well, how do we take advantage of this limited amount of water that comes off in a very short amount of time? These are our 7 water divisions throughout the state in the major drainage basins. Division 1 is the division we're in, South Platte Drainage here. This gives an idea of the amount of active storage that we have, almost 1.8 million acre-feet of active storage in the state, or in that division. And conditional storage means these are rights that are planned out there. They haven't been perfected yet. The reservoirs have not been built yet, but they've been applied for and could be built up an additional 3.46 million acre-feet, which is almost double of what the active storage is. But again, you got to keep in mind, even though you build this additional storage, that available supply we have, it's like having a banking account. You know, a bunch of bank accounts. If you don't have money to put in it, it doesn't generally do any good. So this has been part of the reason why these have not been built. It's somewhat due to that. Environmental reasons as well. Of course, those big dams just create a lot of environmental issues over the years. Two Forks Reservoir is one that back in the 80s that was vetoed for those primary reasons. Well, as you can see, as I mentioned, Colorado being a headwater state, 19 other states rely on water that's generated in Colorado. And what I don't show on here, and I need to get updated, is the Republic of Mexico. We have a U.S. treaty with the Republic of Mexico that we have to maintain a certain amount of water to them as well. And so you can see with all these demands and uses from the Colorado River water, if you will, it creates a lot of challenges for us as being a headwater state to make sure we get that water to our downstream sister states. Well, in Colorado, what's unique, this came about in 1879 when we first created the water commissioners 2 years before we even created our office. We developed a system that was actually embodied in the Constitution of 1876, the prior appropriation doctrine, which means first in time, first in right. When the miners came here in 1859 and started mining for gold and silver, the system that was available in the eastern United States didn't really apply in the western United States. So they developed a system where they could go get water off stream and take it away from the stream, and those who came and put it to use first were first in time, first in right. And that's a system that developed and still exists today. So that means the later you come onto the system and want to use water in Colorado, the more junior you are. You have to stand in line before everybody else that's before you to make sure they get their water before you get your water. And that's very important. I'm going to talk about that. So anybody who's coming in today, for example, if you don't have any senior water rights in Colorado and you want to start up some, let's say, ethanol plant out there, you have to go out and either look for water that's already existing or try to get, apply for a new water right. Well, if you can imagine with these water rights that date back to the 1850s and 60s, they're very senior to you, very difficult to get water in that kind of situation. And I'll talk about ways how we can deal with that. I don't know if that, no, I guess it's time for class to start. There's a fire bill. So in Colorado, we have the prior appropriation doctrine, and as I indicate, that's first in time, first in right. So in periods of water shortage, those who have the most senior rights get their water first. In Colorado, what's unique about this too is a water right is a property right. It can be sold away from the property. So if there's a farmer who's been irrigating out there since 1860 and has a very senior right, and you decide you want to buy it because you have an ethanol operation you want to start up, and you want to make sure you have a very secure senior right to make sure you have water each and every year, you would go out and try to purchase that senior water right from an individual, and they can sell it to you. It's a property right. It can't be severed away from the property. So that's unique in Colorado, and And this certainly is contrasted with what we call the riparian doctrine, which recognizes that water rights being attached to the lands that are adjacent to the river or stream. And I've got a diagram here. As you can see, basically east of the Mississippi River, they operate under the riparian doctrine. So you get your water based on whether you have your property adjacent to that river or stream. As you move west of the Mississippi, and you'll see in Colorado here and a number of the other states, we work on the appropriative system, person time, person right, and some of the states are mixed, like Texas you'll see has got a mix between both riparian and appropriation systems. So depending on where you're going to, say, start up an operation or do any kind of business that deals with water use, you're going to have to understand what type of water administration system that they have in their respective state. In Colorado, believe it or not, 86% of our water is still used in agriculture. Even with the rapid growth we have in municipal and domestic throughout the state, agriculture still represents our largest delivery of water. And so being in a state where there's more demand for water than there is available water, we really have no new water to develop in the state. We just have to take old water and change it over to new uses. So guess what? Where do people usually go when they need to get new water? Agriculture. And that's why it's created a lot of controversy about the concern about going out and drying up ag lands and converting that over to municipal use or any other use, commercial, domestic, industrial, those type of uses. And certainly a number of these operations that come in underneath ethanol type operations, biofuel type operations can fall into this industrial and commercial operation, which, as you can see on a statewide basis, aren't huge water uses, but they're continually growing. As I indicated, we operate our division offices in 7 of the divisions throughout the state that represent each of the major drainage basins. And we have our main office in Denver, and each of the 7 divisions have their own division offices as well that report to our Denver office. And there's some scattered field offices throughout the state, like down here in the southwest part of the state, southeast, just so if people need some services, they don't have to go clear to the main office. Like say in Pueblo, they can go down to La Junta, or don't have to come into Denver. And again, given our technology we have today with a lot of our information on the internet, it makes it very accessible to most people anyway. So, but we have, as I indicated, about 270 employees statewide that we administer all the water in the state, both surface and groundwater. Just like counties that are out there, we have water districts, and they kind of represent the smaller watersheds within those major drainage basins. There are 78 water districts, and we typically have at least 1 water commissioner per district, and in some of the more populous, more active areas like along the Front Range here, we may have 2 of them that may have a lead water commissioner and a backup water commissioner. So if you're doing a lot of, these are people who talk to the people out in the field. If they have questions about water, they will typically run into one of our water commissioners, and those individuals have a lot of knowledge and information about administering water that can help answer a lot of questions for people. DWR, our Division of Water Resources, regulates surface and groundwater for beneficial uses. If you're going to take that water in Colorado and put it to some beneficial use, and here's a list of some of the major beneficial uses in the state, you're going to come under regulation of the Division of Water Resources. And later Gary will talk about if you're going to then use this water and have some form of wastewater coming from it, then he's going to talk about some of the issues on the discharge sides that you're going to have to deal with. And so, as I indicated, a lot of the major uses in irrigation, increasing amounts of municipal, industrial, and commercial, domestic, livestock, minimum stream flows in Colorado. As you can imagine, in the pristine state of Colorado, we like to keep some minimum stream flows, and especially in the mountain areas. So those become very popular. Another one that's become increasingly popular in the last 10 years are recreational in-channel diversions, kayak parks. And there's one of them here in Golden, which is a premier one in the state, where they claim to keep water in the stream through that certain reach for recreational purposes. And it may be like 1,000 cubic feet per second is a claim that they have made on that. So kayakers and so forth can have a world-class experience rafting and kayaking down through those reaches and streams. And again, you guys are the experts on this, but talking to Steve and some others, I pulled together some information on what I understand some of the water use for biodiesel is. And again, I guess it depends. There's quite a wide range whether you're doing this kind of on a home operation or some larger scale. But my understanding of what they presented to me is this water is used to wash that fuel. And so this type of process is typically going to be considered an industrial commercial type process. And the reason I point this out, I'd like feedback from you if you have any, is because as this develops, this industry in Colorado, it's unclear how some of these uses are going to fit in under our scheme of administration, because keep in mind our laws that were written, some of them go back in the 1800s, some of our groundwater laws go back from the 1950s and 60s, so it's not always clear how these laws are going to cover these new uses that weren't certainly anticipated back then. And so I want to at least point out what I understand it to be. And I've given this as a rule of thumb that the water utilization is 1 gallon for each 1 gallon of biodiesel produced. And I've seen different ranges on this. I know, and I think this next slide here, I threw this up just because it deals with ethanol plants, and these are certainly larger ones. But I've seen reports, they talk about this because they've got typically these evaporation cooling towers there, that they use 3 to 5 gallons. And I know that, I don't know if that's all just for evaporation type purposes or anything to do with washing in that process that's similar to biodiesel. I don't know, but it's important to nail down what these amount of uses are, and certainly the rates of diversions that are going to be needed, because depending on whether you're going to use surface water or groundwater in Colorado, you're going to fall under a different regulatory scheme in terms of what type of permit or water right you have to get from the state. And so I wanted to throw these out and mention, as I get into the next few slides here, talking about surface or groundwater use, why that's important and why it's going to, it may kick you into one category or another, and it may involve a lot more work or effort depending on how large the magnitude of water use and rate of flow that you're going to require in your operation. As I've mentioned, when you're dealing with water rights and ownership in Colorado, we deal with the Doctrine of Prior Appropriation. In Colorado, we're a right-to-use state, and that's a usufructory right. That means you don't own the water. It's embodied in the Constitution that the water is owned by the public, and so you don't actually own the water, you just have a right to use it. And so that's very important because this is embodied as we get into what I refer to as the Water Rights Act. We're dealing with both the Groundwater Act and the Water Right Determination Administration Act, and that was the 1969 Act that was passed in Colorado that integrated groundwater use into the surface water administration system. And you can imagine the groundwater uses came typically a lot later than the surface water uses, and once they integrated them in 1969, it's into the priority system, and you have to operate those groundwater uses in conjunction with that priority system. We're dealing with surface water. If you're going to come in and you're going to want to use surface water for your process and divert from a stream, there's some key components you have to comply with to allow you to do that. First, you have to have an intent to use it. That seems kind of obvious, but you need to obviously have some identified use that you're going to put it to. You have to divert that in priority, as I talked about in the priority system, the Doctrine of Prior Appropriation, first in time, first in right. So unless all these other senior water rights that are there already are satisfied, you're not going to be able to divert water from the stream, even though there may be a lot of water flowing by your property where you're at. You've got to make sure you protect all those vested water rights that are already out there. I'm going to talk towards the end here a means in which you can do this, even though you're very junior on the system. I'll talk about how to get around that. You have to beneficially use it without wasting it. And in Colorado, when you're dealing with surface water right and you want to get a water right for that and affirm the priority of that right, you have to go through the water court. That's separate from the Division of Water Resources. Those are done through our district courts in Colorado. And they actually grant the actual water right for that surface water right and confirm that priority so that you can operate within that priority system. If you don't go to court to get that water right affirmed, then you're always a junior water user in the system. So very important if you're dealing with surface water rights that you get your water right adjudicated by the water court. We don't do that, but they do. When we deal with groundwater, most of that, almost all of that regulation in terms of administration and adjudication, if you will, falls within the Division of Water Resources. And I'm going to talk about these 4 different types of groundwater in Colorado. And I know this is going to seem a little bit confusing at first, but it's very important because depending on where you are in the state, if you're utilizing groundwater, there's different rules and regulations that are going to apply. And so a lot of people, as I talk towards the end of my presentation here, where are you going to locate a particular operation is going to be very important. And one of these is what the available supply is, whether you intend to use surface water, groundwater. These type of things are going to be very important. And I'm just going to touch on these briefly, and there's publications on our website that go into this in a lot more detail about these different classifications, different type of well permits you can get, but I'm just going to cover them briefly here. But tributary water. In Colorado, all water is presumed tributary. That means if you pump anything out of the ground, it's presumed to contribute to the stream system. So if you take water out, at some point, either immediately or some point delayed in the future, you're going to impact that stream flow. That's what we call tributary water. And as I talked about, this tributary water is administered within the priority system, just like surface water, because they are interconnected. We finally recognized that back in 1969. There are many other western states who have not recognized this physical phenomenon yet with their laws. And so there's still major conflicts between those surface and groundwater users. And so a lot of those states are catching up and recognizing this tributary nature of the groundwater and the surface water connection. The other end of the spectrum, if you think of tributary water being on this side, being directly connected to the stream system, you go out on this end of the system, and we call it non-tributary groundwater, meaning it has very little or no connection to the surface streams. And I've got a graph here in a couple of slides that talks about where these locations of tributary or non-tributary groundwater are. They're typically these very deep bedrock formations that were formed millions of years ago when the uplift of the Rocky Mountains and we had sedimentary layering of these bedrock formations, and water was trapped in these deep underground aquifers, and those were deposited over millions of years. And as we pump water out of those aquifers now, it's kind of like taking oil out of the ground. When we pump it out, it's a fixed quantity, and when it's gone, it's gone. And so that's what we consider non-tributary groundwater. We have another area within the state, and I'll show you on this map. It's called the Denver Basin. And there's, within the Denver Basin, there's this non-tributary nature of it, just like the second bullet that I talked about there. And this other category, which is a weird one, not non-tributary. But it basically is what I looked at. If you think about the spectrum of tributary, non-tributary, and you're dealing in this area of the not non-tributary, it's kind of this full range in between. It's really not completely non-tributary, yet it's not fully tributary. It's somewhere in between. And so that's unique to the Denver Basin. Fourth type of groundwater we have in the state that we regulate is called designated groundwater. And these are basins that are primarily, solely groundwater usage, very little or no surface water that exists in these basins. So they primarily exist off of groundwater. And here's a map that shows that. Here's the Denver Basin. Right here, you'll see this outline that I'm circling right here is what we call the Denver Basin. And you'll see it extends up to about Greeley, up to the north, Colorado Springs on the south. Here's the Front Range right here, goes up along the foothills, all the way out to Lyman on the east. And they're basically 4 layered aquifers. They're kind of like pancakes there. They go down to about 3,000 feet and then all the way to the surface. And those waters and those aquifers are administered under separate rules and regulations and laws, what we typically refer to as the Denver Basin rules. And you'll see on the eastern portion of that Denver Basin there exists some designated basins as well. Also out here on the eastern plains are what we refer to as our designated basins also, the southern high plains and the northern high plains. If you're familiar with the Great High Plains in this area, these are extensions of the Ogallala Aquifer that exist not only in Nebraska, Kansas, Texas, Oklahoma. It's a huge underground reservoir that extends over multiple states. And we have separate regulations and laws that deal with regulation and pumping out of those basins. And why this is important, and why I know it's a lot of information up here on this slide, and then outside these respective basins, we're dealing with just the basic groundwater laws outside the state. Everything else outside here is presumed tributary unless you prove it to be non-tributary. There are some areas out here in some cases where we found non-tributary groundwater. But these are important, and why I point these out is depending on where you're going to locate your operations is very important. If you get on the western slope here, typically the type of crops that are available for biofuel operations aren't typically the ones that are available. They're typically grown out here on the eastern plains, and that's where a lot of the corn and stuff and soybeans are grown out here in the eastern plains. Center pivot type irrigation out of these deep underground aquifers, who again, keep in mind, have a very limited life. But those are things I would assume you have to take into consideration for, you know, if you've got your operation over here and you're hauling your crop from over here to your plant over here to operate, you know, a lot of times that doesn't make sense. I guess we get all the transportation costs for that. So what we're finding is a lot of these biofuel operations that are starting up in the state of Colorado are out here, typically in northeastern Colorado, because of the source of biofuels that are out there in corn and soybeans. Haven't heard of any here on the western slope, but if you're doing something that's a small scale operation, certainly in your home at that level, then maybe these things can crop up and exist in other areas of the state. But any certainly large scale operations we're seeing in these areas, and some of that deals with, because of the type of water system we have in the state, some of these people like to go for these areas of non-tributary groundwater because it's a ready source of water that you can take out and you're not operating within the priority system. I'm going to talk about two different types of classes of wells that you have when you're trying to get water out of the ground. And, because this is important too, and this gets into the flow rate that you're requesting and the type of usage you're going to have. It's going to dictate what type of well permit you're going to have to get from the Division of Water Resources. When you're dealing with exempt or small capacity wells, and small capacity wells, I refer to that terminology because that's out in the designated basins, and exempt is just leaves outside of designated basins. These are typically the smaller type wells out there. We issue household use only wells, and that's all they're for. They're for household use only inside a single family dwelling, no outside uses. The second type we issue are domestic type permits, and this often includes some outside uses beyond just the household use only. We issue permits for livestock water use, commercial exempt, and there's also another one, commercial non-exempt, we'll talk about. But this is typically in a commercial business like a small gas station, and that's just drinking and sanitary use. They're limited to 1/3 of an acre foot per year, so it's typically a very small commercial operation. There are a lot of wells out there that are unregistered because we didn't have permitting requirements for these type of wells until 1972, and so there were many of them that were constructed that are unregistered with their office. They are slowly coming in and getting registered, though they're probably not very good as well. And also this monitoring observation wells are under this exempt category as well. And that's just strictly for monitoring observation groundwater. The second type of classification you'll hear, and if you look briefly into our publications, you'll see this terminology non-exempt or large capacity wells. And these are typical ones you see that are the bigger type capacity wells. We're dealing with wells and subdivisions through housing developments, irrigation, municipal, commercial, big capacity type wells.
Yeah, I'm just curious, how many gallons in an acre foot?
326,000 gallons in an acre foot, approximately.
Is that a yearly basis or?
Well, that's just a fixed volume. Just like a gallon has 4 quarts, 1 acre foot has 326,000 gallons. It's just talking about a quantity of water, not a rate of flow like 10 gallons per minute, but it's just a fixed volume of water.
So, but to follow up on, in terms of like in the exempt, you were saying it was like, we're basins 100,000 gallons
On the commercial?
No, they're not on the exempt.
On the exempts, those typically range in to a 1/3 of an acre foot to about 3 acre feet.
Yeah,
typically.
You know what an acre foot.
Yeah, and an acre foot's about 326,000 gallons.
That'd be 100,000 to about 1 million gallons
Yeah.
a year.
Yeah.
For an exempt commercial.
3 acre feet's about 1 million gallons.
What would a typical family forest day use in water?
We, this household use only type well I talked about there, in Colorado, if you don't have any outside uses, we figure you can live within 1/3 of an acre foot. Okay. About 110,000 gallons a year. Water use within these homes typically ranges, with these new water saving devices, anywhere from 70 to 80 gallons per person per day. And we typically figure the average in Colorado is about 3 people per house. So you can range up to 210 to 240 gallons per day per household. And so when I talked about some of these numbers that Steve provided to me, if somebody's doing a home production of about 100 gallons a week, you can see that, you know, how much that amount of water compares to how much water somebody's using in just a household use only operation. And that's why I think it's important, and I'll talk about here this in just a couple of slides and I'll be wrapped up, why not quite sure how all of that can fit into some of these type of wells here, whether you're going to get into this exempt type category or a non-exempt type of operation. And that's these are good questions you're asking. In Colorado, if you dig down and intercept groundwater to create a pond, that's considered a well, and you have to get a permit in Colorado. Recovery wells, these are like where you're treating and recovering contaminated groundwater. Geothermal wells, this is another big thing that's taking off in Colorado as well, is this geo-exchange type systems. And we issue permits for any type of geothermal well in the state, and we're issuing quite a few of those anymore. More of them on the western slope than on the east slope. Permanent dewatering systems are also ones that are considered into these non-exempt large capacity wells. And here's what I talk about these differences between these exempts and non-exempt wells. When you're talking about an exempt or small capacity well, keep in mind these are kind of smaller quantities of water. When the legislature set up the laws for this, they said that we don't have to administer those within the priority system. Even though we know they're causing depletions to the stream system, we consider them small. There's a presumption that they're not causing any injury, and so we don't have to administer them into the priority system. And so we just let them go. If you came in and got one of these back in 1930, or you came in and got one in 2007, you're basically treated the same. There's no priority between that person who came first and you when you've got one of these exempt type wells. All of our uses for these type of wells are limited by statute. There's not really a volume associated with them. They're all limited by the type of use. So if you apply for a household use only well, it's for a single family dwelling, no outside uses. We don't make you meter it. We assume we go by, you shouldn't have any outside uses out there. You can't be watering your horses, you can't be watering your lawn, you can't be watering your, washing your car, that type of thing. That's how we administer them. It's not that they're, we know if you keep your uses limited inside, there's only going to be so much water that's going to be produced out of it. Most of them are limited to 15 gallons a minute. And most of them require this return flow to the stream system. This some I think is important, I'll talk about later, before I understand a little bit about some of these operations you do and you want to apply this to the surface. That could be an issue. But they do require return flow back to the stream system, because they figure if you take this water in, you have maybe a 5 to 10% depletion, but about 90 to 95% of that water you use gets back to the stream system. That's what the legislature did, to assume that these things had virtually no impact on other water rights. So keep those in mind. That's why it's important about the level of operation you're going to do for these types of biodiesel, biofuel operations, and whether you fall in one of these other two categories. When we're dealing with non-exempt, or these large capacity wells, they are administered in the priority system. That means they're going to be administered against all these other senior rights who've been out there a long time. So if you come in and want to start up some big ethanol operation plant out northeastern Colorado, you're going to have to consider this. Now there are some exceptions to this. When we're dealing with the Denver Basin non-tributary aquifers that I talked about. If they're considered that they don't have any connection to the stream system, then of course they're not going to be administered within the priority system. But as a general rule, they are. And again, you have to make sure that no material injury occurs to those other vested water rights. If you are, you're going to have to shut down. Yes?
So an example of the ones that are except Denver Basin and all that, I would expect that the Denver Basin would be stricter rules on usage. Is that correct, or is it less?
No, typically not. Typically less restrictive. Because a lot of that water in the Denver Basin is considered non-tributary, and so there is no connection to the stream system. When you get up towards the surface and the most shallow aquifers, they essentially are almost considered tributary, and in those cases you would.
Is it true that, my understanding is that the Denver Basin is rejected?
That's correct.
So isn't that a limited source? Why wouldn't it be more restricted?
Well, because the legislature set up back in 1985, they allocated it on a 100-year basis and said, we know there's a fixed quantity of water there, and we're going to allow people to take it out over 100 years, and when it's gone, it's gone.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah. And that's why people in like Douglas County and Highlands Ranch were so concerned, and why they're looking for alternative supplies, because they know there's a finite life, and why they're looking for renewable supplies out there. That's, if you live here in Colorado, you've read the articles in the Denver papers about the concerns of relying on Denver Basin groundwater. The key about Denver Basin or some of these others, and groundwater in general, is consumptive use. You try to use it in dry years when your surface water is not there. You try to integrate that in, so you try to rely on your surface water as much as you can, but in dry years when you don't have it, you rely on your wells. But where you rely solely on those wells in those basins, it's kind of a trade-off. If you're in a non-tributary formation, you don't have to worry about impacting anybody else, but the reality of it is eventually you're going to run out of water. Either physically or economically, you can't afford to pump it out. Any other questions?
Is there any estimate of like the volume of this Denver Basin?
The Denver Basin, of course, experts will argue over this, but there's conservative estimates about 200 million acre feet of water available, and we're currently taking out about 500,000 acre feet a year right now. So if you do the math, you can maybe say physically it could go 400 years, but practically speaking, some edges of the basin, because they're kind of like bowls, are already running out of water, and most people's wells have gone dry already. If you're out in the middle of the basin, in the sweet spot of the basin, you're in a lot better shape. But as you're towards those edges of that basin, it's like a bathtub. As it's drawn down, your wells are going to go dry. And so, and it's going to get to a point where economically they, even though there may physically be water there, they just can't pump from 3,000 feet and justify the cost to do that. Here's a way in Colorado in which you as a junior user, if you come in, if you're not going to rely on buying one of these senior rights I talked about, and you've got a junior use on the system, you can come in and develop what we call a plan for augmentation. And this is developed from the 1969 Act when we integrated groundwater into the priority system with surface water. You can actually go out and drill a well out there, like a shallow alluvial well on the stream system, or let's say you're going to operate a ethanol plant. We've got some of these going, 2 or 3 in Colorado already. They'll take and drill a 100-foot shallow well, pump out of it, and whatever depletions are associated with that well, they'll go out and find some other source of water to replace those depletions. It could be non-tributary groundwater. It could be trans-mountain water that they do that with. It could be buying senior agricultural rights somewhere in the system and changing them over for augmentation purposes. That's a beneficial use. And so there's a way that we try to integrate this into our system and allow people still to continue to develop water in the state and maximize beneficial use without impacting those senior water rights. And this is how we do it through a plan for augmentation. And so it's important to know that. When you hear that terminology, read some of our brochures, that's what you'll hear. I think maybe my last slide here. Some of the considerations when you're producing biofuels, and I say biofuels, I know you guys are dealing mainly with biodiesel and maybe have a broader interest in biofuels, but in Colorado, obviously the availability of the water supply, whether you're surface or groundwater, not only quantity and quality, but the allowed uses. One of the things I'm not sure is about some of these home operations, whether they would really fit underneath these exempt type wells, because those uses are for drinking and sanitary purposes. And really what you're doing is more of a commercial industrial type operation. Not quite sure how people will view those and how those will fit underneath those exempt type uses, if at all. You may be venturing more into these non-exempt type situations where you may have to develop augmentation plans to make those work. So something to keep in mind, something's evolving, yes.
Is that really, we're talking about 100 gallons a week for a small home operation, right? So that's 5,200 gallons a year on a $100,000, $110,000 or $110,000 gallon usage. Is that something we're pursuing from your perspective?
No, I don't think so. And I think at first blush, it probably will work underneath that. I guess when I was thinking about putting this presentation together, I was thinking about, well, that's no different than probably somebody who's running a still or something in their house, making wine or, what's that?
Or watering their lawn.
Well, they shouldn't be watering their lawn with those. So, if you've got a household use only permit, if you have a lot in Colorado that was that's less than 35 acres, it had to be created prior to 1972 to qualify for that household use designation. Or you have to have 35 acres or more, and then you get a full domestic type use. And I think as a general rule, and it's a good question you bring up, I think if you stay within that range, it could be considered the way the use is defined in the statute says ordinary household purposes for drinking and sanitary purposes. Well, if you're using that quote to wash, for washing, sanitary type operation, it probably will fit when you're talking about 100 gallons a week. But, you know, it's the old adage, you know, about, you know, pigs get fat, hogs get slaughtered. I think if people start doing that and think, oh, well, 100 gallons is good, now I'm going to bump my operation up to 200 gallons a week, and then 300, and, you know, pretty soon they thought everything was hunky-dory, and all of a sudden they've got this major operation going there. And that's what tends to be a problem, because we don't meter those wells, and so we don't know. Someone could have a bottling operation in their home, and, you know, we see a truck backing up to the garage every day and haul a bottle of water off, and, you know, that's not what that was intended either. So that's what I'm saying. You got to be careful there. I think probably that threshold, the 100 gallon thing, probably not going to be a big issue. But as you talk about bigger operations, it's going to be potentially a problem. So just something to keep in mind. Method of wastewater disposal, I know Gary is going to be segueing into what he's going to talk about. You must consider this return flow requirements for exempt wells. I've seen from some of the literature that there's an interest in taking this wastewater and applying it to surface, you know, like to water your lawn or whatever. But that's a problem, because in Colorado, if you got one of these exempt type wells, it requires a septic and leach field systems. And the return flow has to go back to the stream system. It cannot be consumed, cannot be applied to lawns. And Gary can talk about this a little bit. You know, if you're discharging this to a stream or the surface or whatever, you got to have potentially have a discharge permit from the health department. In Colorado, and Gary can touch on this too, we have people who want to use gray water as well. And from what I understand, that's treated just like black water, like sewage water, and has to be disposed of below the surface and not on the surface. So important things to consider when you're dealing with this in Colorado. Of course, I mentioned about the location of these biofuel crops in relationship to your available water supply. You probably know that better than I do, I guess, because you got transportation. And I've read some things in the literature too about these potential recycling opportunities with livestock operations. Wastewater facilities, I guess you don't necessarily always need. These are maybe more in the larger operations. Potable water for this purpose, but they can be used for those recycling waters as your initial supply to the system. Anyways, that's all I have. I'd be welcome to take any other questions you may have here. Here we go. Yes.
A couple of questions. You said an exempt commercial could have up to 3 acre feet.
Exempt commercial is a third of an acre foot. And it's limited to a commercial operation for drinking and sanitary purposes. And the typical example I give is the corner gas station out there where they've got a bathroom where somebody comes in and uses it when they stop and get gas, for example. But it is limited to a third of an acre foot. That is one type of exempt well that we do place a meter on to make sure that they stay within that third of an acre foot, which is 110,000 gallons a year approximately.
What's the largest volume of the access exempts?
The exempts, if you got a full domestic well, meaning if you have 35 acres or more, if you own 35 acres or more in Colorado, you can get a full domestic, which allows you to serve up to 3 single-family dwellings, an acre of lawn and garden, and animal watering. So you could potentially get up to about 3 or so acre feet of water produced out of that well. It's not metered, it's just limited on those types of uses. But that's about the largest amount of use that occurs underneath those type of exempt wells.
Second question regarding San Luis Valley. Let's say an agricultural water right or something was had and you wanted to file for a change of point of diversion.
Right.
How difficult and elaborate is that?
Well, going through that type of change is going to require you to go through water court because it's an adjudicated water right. You're changing through the water court. And you have to go in and you have to quantify what the historical consumptive use is associated with that right. Some engineering involved. That process can take anywhere from 6 months to a couple of years to accomplish. In the interim, we can do a temporary approval through our office for that change in use. There's statutes that allow state engineer's office, our office, to allow someone to do that. And there are some operations like down there, refining type operations. There was a plant that was going to make whiskey. There was the Grimway carrot processing plant. Somebody went down, bought up agricultural rights, transferred them over to a commercial industrial use. A water bottling plant was put in down there. They went through changes of water rights in the water court to change those old uses from agricultural use over to those new uses. But they have to rely on those old uses to change to new uses because the system's over appropriated down there. You couldn't come in today to drill a new well in there without doing a plant for augmentation. And that's even more difficult. Or it has to be one of the exempts, you're right. If you could fit her in the exempt category, that's good. And again, depending on how big your operation is, you might fit under the commercial exempt. If it's a home type operation, you might fit under one of those domestic, either household use only or domestic use type permits. If you're talking the range of 100 gallons that we mentioned. I don't know. It's one of those things that I don't know where you eventually cross the line of someone going, wait a minute, they're running a commercial operation in that house there. There's, you know, they got a sign up and they're advertising and people are coming up and filling up with fuel there every day. If you're using it for your own personal use, probably not going to be a big deal. You start selling it or something, and that's where we continue in. I think as a general rule, anybody's operations, if you're doing working, you know, we allow people to work out of their house, but when they start having customers come in, you got a beauty salon going there or something, okay, you can probably cross the line, you're in a commercial operation. If you start selling your water, you start selling the product that you're using from that water, you can probably cross the line over from an exempt type operation to a non-exempt, and then it opens up into a lot bigger realm. Yes,
If you have successfully achieved a plan for augmentation, are those transferable?
Yes, they are. And again, because those water rights are property rights, and you can transfer them to somebody else just by deed. Very simple to do. And that's part of the problem in Colorado. People have not tracked those ownerships of water rights like they do other property rights, and so there is no place you can go out there and find out who owns all these water rights. They attempted to do that a few years ago and have our agency do it, and they charged a fee for it, and it just was such a big mess they stopped it after a year. And so there's no good tracking of who owns all these rights. When you file at the water court, you have to tell them who it is and who's changing it, but then when it's subsequently sold, it's not like your house, which is tracked through a title company and all of that. Very difficult to monitor those changes.
Just to follow up, sorry. If you're selling your property and you have a plan for augmentation, you withhold that plan for augmentation.
Yes, you can. Yep. Typically, you can do that with those type of things. When you're dealing with exempt type wells, and you got your exempt well serving your house, and again, because it's a right to use state, that's typically assumed unless you exclude it out of your deed, and you excluded any water rights out of it, those are assumed to transfer with the property. And typically it's very difficult, I don't know if anybody's been able to do it, to reserve those exempt wells away from the house that you sell. Somebody's going, well, where's my water supply? They're not going to buy it without that well. So, you know, that typically doesn't work. But these other type operations, if you start up some commercial operation and the next person doesn't want to deal with that, you can take your audit plan and sell it to somebody else if you want. It may require an additional change after that, but if you're moved in somewhere else, you can do that. I think there's a question here. Yes.
This question's a little off topic, but I've been trying to understand this in Colorado for a while. So in Australia and arid regions, it's my understanding that rainwater capture is required. In Colorado, it's illegal. And what I've had trouble understanding is that if you're a residential user, you can talk a lot about in the cities, not well enough city system. You're doing rainwater capture. The amount you're capturing, from my understanding, would be so much smaller than what's actually infiltrating because the water use is so small. And what you're going to be, if you're returning into the sewer and not allowing it to infiltrate, it seems like you're going to be net positive on the overall water going into the system. Of course, my understanding is it's the downstream user that owns that water that you're taking that right away from them to get that downstream water. But is there an ecological or like physical reason and non-political reason?
It's all legal at this point. I think they recognize the physical situation. And you see a movement towards this. There's a study that was done this past year in Douglas County that was looking at just that. where there's a lot of push towards having Colorado allow rainwater harvesting like a lot of the other surrounding western states. It makes a lot of sense ecologically. Physically, I think studies show that there's a net gain in most residential settings. It's just the quirky way that our laws are set up right now that it's presumed that there's some impact and legally you can't do it. And so, you know.
It's hard to imagine capturing it out there. There's not a spillover. It's will not have much of an impact.
Right. And these recent studies that were done show that. And this is me personally, not speaking on behalf of the department. I think there'll be some laws here soon that will recognize that and allow it. It's just, it'll probably be fought by a lot of those downstream seniors who think they may be impacted by it, but if they're convinced through the modeling and studies show that they're not going to be impacted, they might eventually concede through some type of legislation to allow that to occur to some degree. They might say, we'll allow you to capture, and probably recognize the efficiencies of the system, we'll allow you to capture 70% of it, because historically, maybe about 30% of it always returned to the stream system. I think their concern about it is, with these typical rainwater harvesting systems, they capture everything and utilize it and consume it, and there is no return flow. But, your lawn catches rainfall that comes off there that was there maybe before, after the native vegetation. So there's a lot of these things that are happening incidentally on the system, but it's when you actually take a physical means to divert and put that to use is when it runs afoul of the current water legal system.
It just seems crazy to use drinking water, chlorinated water.
You're right. I agree, and that's why, that's in one respect where I think Colorado is way behind some of the other states recognizing that, but that's going to take a legislative fix to change that. But your point's right on. It's well taken. Yes, sir.
Is there any movement along the graywater front, similar?
Well, I think that will tie in somewhat to that type of thing too. But there is some ability to use graywater even with our current system. Gary maybe talked about that a little bit from a discharge standpoint, but if you got, say, a domestic well permit that allows you to irrigate your lawn, well, yeah, we'd rather you take some of your gray water and irrigate your lawn and pump it out with a well. So from our standpoint, from the laws that we are regulating under, we don't have a problem with it. Now, the dairy shop may have a problem with it because they may not want you to take gray water and discharge it on the surface for water quality reasons. So a household use only well is a problem because there is no outside use, so you can't take your gray water that you have inside your home and go water your plants outside. That's just because it's really purely a legal prohibition that there's no outside uses. Because they have that return flow requirement. They're assuming that that return flow is coming back to the stream system and minimize the impact on all those seniors that are out there. So, good question. Yeah.
Early in your talk, you were talking about different water districts in the state. The northeast corner of the state,
Yes.
I had heard that a bunch of wells got shut down out there for farmers. I was wondering if you could speak to what happened there and what the outlook is for.
Right, Matt. It's a complicated one, and it's still being studied by a special task force, which I'm on. We actually got to go to Sterling tomorrow. But that's a recognition of those large capacity wells that were constructed starting, say, the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And ultimately, when the '69 Act was passed, they were integrated into the priority system and had to be administered in priority with all those senior surface water rights. And they have been underneath approvals by our office from 1972 until 2002, when the legislature enacted new laws, and we had a drought that came, and all of a sudden the physical supply in the system wasn't enough to meet all the demands for uses in the system. And so these wells that were very junior to the senior users had to scale back. And so a number of them who didn't have enough augmentation water available to keep operating had to shut down. There's still, there's about 5,000 operating wells still out there, and only about 2,500 that were curtailed out of those operations because there just wasn't enough augmentation water available. And when they've got these plants set up, when water supplies get good again and they have recharge and everything going, the water supplies will get better, they'll be able to phase back in and do some level of operation. So it's kind of an ebb and flow thing with those junior users, depending on what the water conditions are. There's more that can come on in drier years, less of them can operate because there's just only so much water available for them to operate.
decided on a year-by-year basis, or did you say, you know, let's do 5 years before we come up with these guys?
No, it's determined on a year-to-year basis. They have to do some projection out, either 3 to 6 years of what they think their anticipated replacement supplies will be or augmentation supplies will be. Because keep in mind, they not only got to cover their current pumping, but they've got to cover all that pumping that's caused depletions from prior years that are now hitting the stream system. If you're a long distance away from the stream, it takes many years for those depletions to hit the stream. And so they're still making up for all those depletions from prior year pumping on top of wanting to irrigate now. And that's what really strapped these guys, that they made it very difficult to operate. But it is just a fraction of those wells that were completely shut down. There's a large portion of them too that had to scale way back to like a 30% quota instead of a 100% quota. And it merely reflects the administration system we're in. They're very junior users on the system. And so when water gets short, like we had in 2002 and since then, they had to scale back.
We'd like to thank Dick for coming.